So, welcome to what I like to call a forensic explainer. Today, we're performing a civilizational autopsy on Han China and the Roman Empire. We're going to uncover exactly why two remarkably similar ancient superpowers, both of them commanding just vast swaths of the globe, met entirely divergent fates. It's this fascinating story of political economy, institutional design, and human geography. We aren't just looking at history today either, we're looking at the institutional blueprints that quite literally built our modern world. To really understand their distinct civilizational DNA, we're going to dissect them organ by organ. We'll look at two empires, two destinies, the machine versus contract, the gods and the state, assimilating the barbarians, and finally, unpack the legacies of the fallen.
Section 1. Two empires, two destinies. Let's set the stage right in the 1st century AD.
Just imagine a time when two absolute behemoths unknowingly mirrored each other at opposite ends of the known world. The sheer scale here is wild. You've got Han China, with roughly 60 million people commanding 4 million square kilometers, and over in the west, the Roman Empire, about 50 million people spread across 5 million square kilometers. It is this eerie symmetry. Both were heavily reliant on agriculture, both were building massive waterworks and roads, and both were facing these shared existential threats from nomadic tribes pressing violently against their northern borders. Yet, they were only faintly connected by rumors and the absolute thinnest threads of the early silk trade.
But, this symmetry wasn't totally lost on them. The Book of Later Han, which is the official Chinese dynastic history, records this absolutely remarkable observation about the Romans. It says, "Its people are tall and upright in bearing, resembling the people of the Middle Kingdom." For a dynasty that, let's be honest, generally regarded all outsiders as barbarians, this shows a profound, rare civilizational respect. They conceptually treated Rome as peers. But despite this shared starting line, they were sprinting toward completely different destinies. Both ultimately collapsed, sure, but Han China came back, again and again, while Europe never fully reunified.
Which brings us to Section 2, the machine versus contract.
To diagnose their eventual collapse, we first have to compare their fundamental operating systems, because every empire runs on a theory of power. Han China functioned as what we'll call the machine. Think of it as an all-encompassing bureaucratic engine rooted in a strict Confucian moral hierarchy. The emperor held the mandate of heaven, and right below him was an intensely structured civil service. And this system demanded total obedience. It wasn't just about extracting taxes, it was a mechanism literally designed to digest its massive population into a single unified cultural identity.
Rome, on the other hand, operated on an entirely different premise. We'll call it the contract. Rome was built on legal authority. Honestly, the system didn't care all that much about your cultural background. So, a Roman emperor like Trajan could be born in Spain, or Septimius Severus in North Africa. It didn't matter. As long as the laws of the Republic and the Empire were maintained, and as long as you obeyed the civic structures and paid your taxes, you were part of the system. Citizenship was a legal fiction. It wasn't a cultural mandate. When you dig into the academic comparisons of their administration, the divide is striking. China centralized power through an ever-expanding, uniform bureaucracy designed to impose cultural homogeneity. Rome leaned heavily on a complex evolution of legal precedents and decentralized magisterial authority. Basically, one system built a cultural monolith, and the other built a vast, legally binding corporate structure.
Moving on to Section 3, the gods and the state. Now we turn to their spiritual organs.
We really need to analyze how each empire handled the immense psychological and social voids that open up during times of plague, famine, and crisis. Both empires encountered massive, popular foreign faiths, but their approaches? Radically different. In the East, Han China systematically absorbed the foreign faith of Buddhism. They wove it into a triad with Confucianism and Taoism, essentially turning it into a tool to stabilize the lower classes. It served the state. On the Roman side, Christianity actually outlasted the state and eventually replaced it entirely, becoming the dominant power itself.
And this wasn't just some theological shift, it was an infrastructural one. Early Christians didn't just preach, right? They provided genuine social safety nets. When Roman institutions fled during the brutal plagues of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christians stayed behind. They fed the poor, they nursed the sick, and because they stepped in and filled this massive void, the church was perfectly positioned to inherit the empire's administrative and legal skeleton after Rome fell in 476 AD. They essentially became the only pan-European institution left standing.
All right, Section 4, assimilating the barbarians. Our autopsy reaches its most critical juncture here.
If you want to know why a state fails, you absolutely have to look at how it handles the military and demographic threat of foreign invaders. Han China utilized a ruthless but undeniably effective melting pot strategy. They didn't just want coexistence, they demanded conversion. They settled surrendered Xiongnu tribes on the frontier under strict monitoring. They forced the sons of foreign elites to study in Confucian academies. I mean, look at the Xianbei ruler, Tua Bahong. He literally mandated Chinese surnames, Chinese dress, and banned his own native language at court. The invaders weren't just defeated, they were digested. They became Chinese.
Now, I want to be clear here. This assimilation was not painless. The aggressive, frankly abusive policies used by the Eastern Han against the Qiang people triggered a century of revolt. This massive destabilization drained the imperial treasury of hundreds of billions of coins. To put that into perspective, it completely exhausted the state's military resources and birthed ruinous warlords like Dong Zhao. It ultimately fractured the empire from the inside out.
Rome faced very similar pressures, but opted for a patchwork system. Rather than culturally digesting the Germanic tribes pushing at the Rhine, Rome effectively outsourced its border defense. They settled entire tribes, like the Visigoths, as foederati, or allies. They paid them in land and wages to guard the frontiers, but critically, and this is the key difference, they allowed them to keep their own chiefs, their own independent laws, and their own weapons.
And here is why this matters. What happens when a state built entirely on a transactional contract runs out of money? Well, it gets remarkably dark. When the Roman treasury dried up, corrupt frontier officials actually started trading rotten meat to starving Gothic refugees in exchange for their children as slaves. It was incredibly grim. And unsurprisingly, the legal contract violently broke. Because there was no shared, deeply rooted cultural identity to hold the whole shebang together, the tribes revolted and the civilization shattered.
Section 5. Legacies of the Fallen. We've arrived at our final diagnosis. Let's examine the vastly different modern worlds these two collapsed giants left behind. China's reliance on the machine, that unified, fiercely enforced cultural identity, meant its civilizational DNA acted a lot like gravity. Even when the state broke into pieces, that shared cultural operating system constantly reassembled those pieces back into unified massive states. Rome, by contrast, relied on the contract. So when it fell, it stayed fractured. However, its absolute genius for law and plurality didn't just vanish. It left a delayed legacy, forming a bedrock for modern Western political civilization and international law a full millennium later.
Ultimately, the peoples who pierced the Great Wall were over generations digested into a single nation. They adopted the script, the philosophy, the identity. But those Germanic tribes who crossed the Rhine, they maintained their distinct identities. They settled, they fractured, and they eventually evolved into the distinct, fiercely independent nation-states of modern Europe.
So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. Look at the divided map of modern Europe today. Is this fragmentation simply the ultimate long-term consequence of Rome choosing the legal contract over the cultural machine? If Rome had digested its invaders the way the Han Dynasty did, would Europe today be a single, massive, continuous nation? It's a huge question of institutional legacy, and it's one that absolutely still defines the global balance of power today. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning the blueprints of our world.